There's an estate in North Carolina that nearly destroyed the family that built it. Not in 1895 when they finished construction. Not during the Great Depression when every other Gilded Age mansion was being torn down for scrap. But in the 1970s, when the tax bill came due and the descendants discovered what their great-grandfather had really done to them, George Vanderbilt spent $6 million building the largest private home in American history. 250 rooms, 178,926 square feet, 4 acres under one roof. But here's what the tour guides don't tell you. The construction killed workers whose names never made it into any official record. The land was acquired through methods that destroyed local families. And when George died, the estate taxes were so catastrophic that his widow had to make a choice. Open the house to tourists and violate everything the Vanderbilt stood for, or lose it entirely. This is the story of what American royalty will do to protect a lie. George Vanderbilt throws open the doors of Biltmore Estate on Christmas Eve, 1895. His family and friends arrive to find something impossible. A French chateau sitting in the North Carolina mountains. More magnificent than anything in Newport or New York or even Europe itself. 250 rooms, 65 fireplaces, 3 kitchens, an indoor swimming pool with 70,000 gallons of heated water at a time when most Americans were still bathing in tin tubs. The numbers tell a story. 6 years of construction. More than 1,000 workers at peak. Stonemasons brought from Europe because American craftsmen didn't have the skills. An entire railway built just to transport materials to the site. Millions of pounds of Indiana limestone shipped hundreds of miles. The cost was $6 million in $1,895. Today, that would be over $200 million. But here's what the Christmas Eve guests didn't see. The construction records that were never kept. The worker deaths that were never counted. The families who were told their father or husband or son had simply moved on to another job when in reality they were buried somewhere on the 125,000-acre estate. We know that at least 1,000 workers were on site during construction. We know that industrial accidents were common in the 1890s. We know that large construction projects regularly killed workers. The Brooklyn Bridge killed at least 27 men. The Hoover Dam killed 96. The Golden Gate Bridge killed 11, but for Biltmore, there are no official death records. None. Not a single worker fatality is documented in any public archive. Not in Asheville newspapers, not in county death certificates, not in church burial records. Either George Vanderbilt built the largest private residence in American history without a single worker dying, or someone made sure those deaths disappeared. The question hanging over that Christmas Eve celebration is simple and disturbing. How many men died building the house where you're drinking champagne? And why doesn't anyone want to talk about it? Let's talk about how George Vanderbilt acquired his empire. The official story is charming. George visited Asheville in 1888. He fell in love with the mountains. He began quietly buying land from local farmers and landowners, paying fair prices, treating everyone with respect. Eventually, he owned 125,000 acres, nearly 200 square miles, an area larger than many eastern states. The family tells us that farmers were happy to sell. The land had been logged out, farmed to exhaustion, abandoned. It was nearly worthless. George paid reasonable prices, and everyone benefited. It's a lovely story. It's also incomplete. What the official narrative doesn't mention are the families who didn't want to sell. The multi-generational farms that suddenly found themselves surrounded by Vanderbilt property. The water rights that were quietly redirected. The access roads that were blocked. The legal pressure that was applied when polite offers were refused. We have fragments of evidence. A court case from 1891 involving disputed property boundaries. A newspaper article from 1892 mentioning farmers who complained about being forced out. Letters in the Buncombe County archives that reference land disputes that were settled out of court with no public record of the terms. One family in particular keeps appearing in fragmentary records. The Presley family had farmed the same land since before the Civil War. Their property sat directly in the path of Georgia's planned approach road. In 1890, they were negotiating with Vanderbilt's representatives. By 1891, they were gone. The land was his. There is no record of a sale. There is no probate record suggesting the family died. There is no deed transfer in the county records. The Presleys simply vanished from Asheville, and their land became part of Biltmore. This pattern repeats. Multiple families who had lived in the area for decades suddenly disappear from local records in the early 1890s. Their property shows up in Vanderbilt's holdings, but the mechanism by which this happened is missing from public archives. What we know ends here, but let me ask you something. When a Vanderbilt wants land and a farmer doesn't want to sell, who do you think wins that negotiation? And if the terms of those victories were completely legal and above board, why are the records missing? Richard Morris Hunt was the most prestigious architect in America. He designed the pedestal for the Statue of Liberty. He created the palatial cottages in Newport for the Astors and Vanderbilts. When George commissioned him to design Biltmore in 1889, Hunt was at the peak of his career. He was 62 years old, healthy, successful, and about to create his masterpiece. He died before it was finished. On July 31, 1895, Richard Morris Hunt died suddenly at his summer cottage in Newport. The cause was listed as heart failure. He was 68 years old. Biltmore was 5 months away from opening. Hunt never saw the completed building. The timing is interesting. Hunt died in July 1895. Biltmore opened in December 1895. During those 5 months, there was a flurry of activity at the estate. Changes were made to the interior. Certain rooms were altered, documents were transferred, and when the house finally opened, several design elements that Hunt had specified were different from his original plans. Who authorized those changes? George Vanderbilt, presumably. But Hunt's original plans, the ones that would show us exactly what was altered and why, are not available to researchers. They're held in a private archive. Access is restricted. Here's what we do know. Hunt had kept meticulous records of every project he'd worked on. His papers include detailed correspondence with clients, contractors, and suppliers. For Biltmore, we have some early sketches and general plans. But the detailed construction documents, the ones that would show how much was actually spent, where materials came from, and what problems arose during construction, those are sealed. Hunt's death was sudden. His papers were gathered by his family. And the most sensitive documents about Biltmore somehow ended up in private hands rather than public archives. We know Hunt had disagreements with George about certain aspects of the design. We know from surviving letters that Hunt was concerned about cost overruns. We know he questioned some of Georgia's decisions about materials and labor. What we don't know is whether Hunt discovered something about the construction that troubled him, whether he threatened to go public with concerns about worker safety or financial irregularities. Whether his sudden death at age 68, just months before the grand opening, was as natural as the death certificate claimed. The official story is simple. A 68-year-old man died of heart failure. It happens, but it happened at a very convenient time, and the records that might tell us more are locked away where researchers can't access them. George Vanderbilt claimed he spent $6 million building Biltmore. In 1890, $5, that's an enormous sum. Today, it would be over $200 million. But when you actually try to account for where that money went, the numbers don't work. Let's break it down. The Indiana limestone alone required millions of pounds of stone, quarried, cut, numbered, and transported by rail from Bedford, Indiana to Asheville, then up a specially built railway to the construction site. Just the stone should have cost close to $2 million based on similar projects of that era. The labor force peaked at over 1,000 workers. If we assume an average wage of $2 per day, which was standard for skilled labor in the 1890s, and construction lasted 6 years, that's over $4 million in wages alone. We're already at $6 million just for stone and labor. We haven't counted the imported materials from Europe, the elaborate furnishings, the artwork, the mechanical systems, the landscaping by Frederick Law Olmsted, the 3-mile approach road, or the dozens of outbuildings. Similar projects from the same era give us comparison points. The breakers in Newport, also a Vanderbilt property, was completed in 1895 for $7 million. It's 65,000 square feet. Biltmore is 178,926 square feet. Nearly 3 times larger. Yet somehow it costs less? We have fragments of financial records in various archives, payment receipts for specific items, invoices from suppliers, contracts with craftsmen. When you add up what we can verify, the total exceeds $6 million before you even finish the main structure. So where did the rest of the money come from? George's inheritance was substantial, certainly. But $6 million was a significant portion even of a Vanderbilt fortune. And if he spent more than $6 million, as the evidence suggests, why did he consistently claim the lower figure? One possibility is tax avoidance. Estate taxes were being debated in the 1890s. If George died and left behind a property worth $10 or $15 million, the inheritance tax burden on his heirs would be crushing. By claiming construction costs of only $6 million, he could potentially reduce the assessed value of the estate. Another possibility is that some of the money went places George didn't want documented. Payments to local officials to smooth over land disputes, settlements with families of workers who died on site, bribes to county clerks to make certain records disappear. We can't prove this. The complete financial records of Biltmore's construction are not available to researchers. They're held by the Biltmore Company, which is still owned by George's descendants. Access is denied. Freedom of Information Act requests don't apply to private companies, and North Carolina has no law requiring historic estates to open their archives. The official record ends here. But consider this. If the construction of Biltmore was completely legal, completely ethical, and completely transparent, why are the financial records still sealed 130 years later? George Vanderbilt imported stonemasons from Italy, France, and England because American craftsmen didn't have the skills for what he wanted. These European workers arrived by the dozens. They carved the limestone facade by hand. They created the ornate details that make Biltmore's exterior breathtaking, and then many of them disappeared. We have passenger manifests showing European workers arriving in New York in the early 1890s, with Asheville, North Carolina listed as their destination. We have payroll fragments showing Italian and French names on the Biltmore construction ledgers, but we don't have emigration records showing them leaving. We don't have death certificates. We don't have naturalization papers or census records showing them settling in America. They arrived, they worked, they vanished. The most logical explanation is that some went home to Europe after the job was done. But there should be ship manifests for their return journeys. There should be paper trails. For some workers, those records exist. For many others, they don't. One name keeps appearing in fragmentary records, Giuseppe Moretti. He was an Italian stonemason who worked on Biltmore from 1890 to 1893. We know this because his name appears on payroll ledgers that survived in private collections. We know he was highly skilled because he was paid significantly more than other workers. We know he had a wife and 2 children in Italy because he sent money home regularly through a bank in Asheville. And then, in November 1893, Giuseppe Moretti's name disappears from every record. No final payroll entry. No departure noted. No death certificate. His remittances to Italy stop. His family in Italy eventually contacts the bank in Asheville asking about him. The bank's response, preserved in their archives, is brief. Mr. Moretti is no longer employed at Biltmore Estate. His whereabouts are unknown. His family never heard from him again. There is no record of what happened to Giuseppe Moretti. He is one of dozens of workers whose trail goes cold at Biltmore. Industrial accidents were common in the 1890s, working with massive blocks of limestone, operating primitive machinery, constructing walls 4 stories high without modern safety equipment. Workers died regularly on large projects. It wasn't scandalous. It was expected. What is unusual is the complete absence of documentation. When a worker died on the Brooklyn Bridge, there was a death certificate, a burial record, usually a newspaper mention. When a worker died at Biltmore, apparently, there was nothing. The official record ends at this point. What we can infer from similar cases suggests a pattern. When wealthy industrialists wanted to avoid negative publicity, workers who died on their projects were buried quietly. Families were paid small settlements in exchange for silence. Records were not filed with county authorities. The dead simply disappeared from history. Did this happen at Biltmore? We can't prove it. But we can prove that over 1,000 workers were on site for 6 years, and not a single death is documented. Either George Vanderbilt was the luckiest builder in American history, or someone made sure the bodies didn't make it into public records. George Vanderbilt died in 1914 at age 51 during a routine appendectomy. He left behind his wife Edith, their 13-year-old daughter Cornelia, and the largest private residence in American history. He also left behind a financial disaster. Biltmore was operating at a loss. The agricultural operations weren't generating enough income. The estate required an army of servants to maintain. The costs were staggering, and George had not prepared for estate taxes. When the tax bill came, Edith faced a choice: sell the estate or find a way to make it profitable. She chose to fight. But the fight nearly destroyed everything. The estate taxes on George's fortune were substantial. We don't have the exact figures because those records are sealed, but we can estimate based on similar estates of that era. The bill was likely in the millions of dollars. Edith had to raise cash immediately. In 1916, she sold 86,000 acres of the original 125,000-acre estate to the federal government. This land became Pisgah National Forest. The sale raised approximately $5 million. It saved the estate from immediate bankruptcy. But it also meant the grand vision of a vast, self-sufficient estate was dead. Even with that sale, Biltmore continued to bleed money through the 1920s. Edith reduced staff, closed off unused rooms, scaled back operations, but it wasn't enough. By 1930, during the Great Depression, the estate was facing another financial crisis. That's when Edith made the decision that would have horrified George. She opened Biltmore to paying tourists. For $1, anyone could tour the ground floor rooms. The private palace became a public attraction. Society was scandalized. The Vanderbilts opening their home to strangers, charging admission? It was unthinkable, but Edith had run out of options. It was either open the doors or lose everything. The tourism income helped, but it still wasn't enough to fully support the estate. Biltmore continued to struggle financially through the 1930s and 40s. When Edith died in 1958, she left behind an estate that was technically solvent but barely, and then came the real crisis. In the 1970s, estate tax laws changed. The new rules would have required George's grandson to pay crushing taxes when the estate passed to the next generation. The bill would have been so large that the only way to pay it would be to sell Biltmore itself. The family lobbied Congress. They hired lawyers and accountants. They restructured the estate as a firm profit corporation. They fought desperately to find a legal mechanism that would allow them to keep Biltmore without being bankrupted by taxes. They succeeded, barely, but the price was steep. Biltmore today is no longer a family home in any traditional sense. It's a business, a tourist attraction, a commercial enterprise that happens to be owned by descendants of George Vanderbilt. The Vanderbilts kept their palace, but they lost what it represented. The age of private estates maintained through inherited wealth was over. The only way Biltmore survived was by becoming exactly what George never intended, a spectacle for the public. The Biltmore Company controls access to the estate's historical archives. Researchers who want to study the construction period must apply for permission. Access is granted selectively. Certain documents are off-limits entirely. Why? What's in those archives that can't be made public 130 years after construction? We know from researchers who have been granted limited access that the archives contain construction ledgers, correspondence with suppliers, personal letters from George and Edith, photographs of the construction process, and legal documents related to land acquisition and estate management. What we don't know is what's been removed, what documents were destroyed, what records were deemed too sensitive to preserve. In 1930, when Edith opened Biltmore to tourists, she also commissioned the first official history of the estate. The author was given access to family papers and archives. The resulting book, published in 1932, is a glowing tribute to George's vision and Edith's courage. It mentions no worker deaths, no land disputes, no financial difficulties, no ethical concerns. Subsequent historians have tried to dig deeper. Most have been denied access to key documents. Those who were granted access report that certain files are simply missing. Correspondence from the construction period has gaps. Payroll records from certain years are incomplete. Legal files related to land purchases are heavily redacted or absent. The Biltmore Company's position is that these are private family papers. They have no obligation to open them to researchers. Legally, they're correct. But the decision to keep these records sealed raises an obvious question. What are they hiding? If the construction of Biltmore was completely ethical, if no workers died, if all land was acquired fairly, if all finances were transparent, there would be no reason to restrict access. Opening the archives would only enhance the estate's reputation. It would provide valuable historical documentation. It would allow scholars to fully understand how one of America's greatest private estates was built. But the archives remain closed, and that tells us something. The official record ends here. But let me ask you something. If your great-grandfather built something wonderful, something you're proud of, something that's now a tourist attraction visited by millions, would you hide the records of how it was built? Or would you want the world to know the full story? The Vanderbilt descendants have chosen to hide it. That choice suggests there's something in those archives that would damage the carefully constructed image of Biltmore as a benevolent project built with fair wages and ethical labor practices. What's in those sealed files? We can't know for certain. But we can't infer from what's missing from public records. Death certificates that should exist but don't. Land deeds that should show clear transfers but are mysteriously absent. Financial records that should reconcile with Georgia's claimed $6 million expenditure but apparently don't. Somewhere in the Biltmore Company's archives is the real story of how this estate was built. The complete story. The uncomfortable story. and the descendants have decided that story should remain buried. Over the decades, there have been lawsuits involving Biltmore Estate, not many, but enough to establish a pattern. And almost all of them ended the same way, settled out of court with terms sealed by confidentiality agreements. We know about these cases because court dockets are public record. We know when suits were filed, who filed them, and what the general claims were. What we don't know is how they were resolved because the settlements are confidential. In 1947, a lawsuit was filed by the descendants of a local family claiming that land, seized from their ancestors in the 1890s, had been taken through coercion. The suit claimed that Vanderbilt representatives had threatened to use political connections to condemn the property if the family didn't sell voluntarily. The case went through initial hearings. Then suddenly, it was settled. The terms were sealed. The family never spoke publicly about it again. In 1968, another suit was filed by former estate workers, claiming they had been exposed to hazardous materials during renovation work without proper protective equipment. The suit named the Biltmore Company as a defendant. It proceeded through discovery. Documents were subpoenaed, and then it was settled, terms sealed, no public disclosure. In 1983, a lawsuit involving a construction accident on the estate resulted in allegations that safety protocols were inadequate and that the company had known about dangerous conditions but failed to correct them. Settlement. Terms sealed. This pattern repeats across decades. Whenever someone files a suit that threatens to expose uncomfortable details about the estate's history or operations, the case settles before trial. The settlement includes strict confidentiality provisions. The plaintiffs are prohibited from discussing what they learned or what compensation they received. This is legal. This is how powerful institutions protect themselves. But it also means that a significant amount of information about Biltmore has been buried in sealed court files that the public can never access. What's in those settlement agreements? We can't know. But we can observe the pattern. Biltmore has consistently chosen to pay money to make problems go away rather than allow cases to proceed to trial where evidence would become public record. That's the behavior of an institution with something to hide. It's the largest private home in American history. It's a masterpiece of architecture. It's a symbol of Gilded Age access. It's a tourist attraction that draws over 1 million visitors every year, but it's also something else. It's a monument built on the labor of workers whose names we'll never know. It's a palace constructed on land that may have been taken from families who didn't want to sell. It's a fortune that nearly bankrupted the descendants who inherited it. And it's a carefully maintained image that requires keeping certain records permanently sealed. We don't know how many workers died building Biltmore. We don't know how many families lost their land to George Vanderbilt's ambitions. We don't know the full financial cost of construction or where all that money went. We don't know what's in the sealed court settlements or the restricted archives. What we do know is this: every great American monument has blood on its foundation. The Brooklyn Bridge killed 27 workers. The Hoover Dam killed 96. The Empire State Building killed 5. These deaths were documented, mourned, and remembered. But at Biltmore, there is no memorial to the workers who built it. There is no acknowledgement that construction on this scale inevitably came at a human cost. The official story is one of vision and beauty and careful planning. The workers are invisible. George Vanderbilt wanted to create something that would last forever. He succeeded. Biltmore still stands. It's still owned by his descendants. It's still magnificent. But the price of that permanence was paid by people whose names don't appear in any of the estate's official histories. Italian stonemasons who came to America and never went home. Local families who lost their land. Workers who died in accidents that were never recorded. The estate tours don't mention them. The guidebooks don't acknowledge them. The archived records that might tell their stories are sealed away where researchers can't access them. This is what American royalty looks like when you strip away the carefully managed image. It's beautiful on the surface. Underneath, it's built on the same foundation as every other monument to wealth and power: exploitation, secrecy, and the deliberate erasure of inconvenient truths. Stand at the entrance to Biltmore today and you're looking at 178,926 square feet of privilege, 4 acres under one roof, 250 rooms that George Vanderbilt built for himself while paying workers wages so low they couldn't afford to feed their families. A palace that nearly bankrupted the people who inherited it. A monument that survives only because the descendants were willing to turn their private sanctuary into a commercial enterprise. The cottage, as George called it, with either modesty or irony, stands on the highest point overlooking the French Broad River. From that elevation, you can see for miles across the Blue Ridge Mountains. What you can't see are the bodies buried somewhere on those 8,000 remaining acres. The families displaced to clear the land. The workers who arrived and never left. The truth that was deliberately hidden so the Vanderbilt name could remain untarnished. George Vanderbilt wanted to build something beautiful. He succeeded. But beauty always has a price. And at Biltmore, that price was paid by people whose names we'll never know, whose stories were never told, whose graves were never marked. The question isn't whether Biltmore is magnificent. It is. The question is whether magnificence built on hidden suffering is worth celebrating. And that's a question each visitor has to answer for themselves. The estate tours continue. The tourists keep coming. The Vanderbilt descendants still profit from their great-grandfather's vision. And the archives remain sealed, protecting secrets that are now more than a century old. Some truths, apparently, are too dangerous to acknowledge. Even 130 years later,